Now remember our last time, there was a poem that Alice was going to recite, and it's a very silly poem. And I want you to think of some of the things that you think are silly in this poem. In my youth, Father William replied to his son, I feared it might injure the brain, but now that I'm perfectly sure I have none, why I do it again and again. You were old, said the youth, as I mentioned before, and I have grown most uncommonly fat. Yet you turned a back somersault in at the door. Pray, what is the reason of that? In my youth, said the sage as he shook his gray locks, I kept all my limbs very supple, but the use of this ointment went shilling the box. Allow me to sell you a couple. You are old, said the youth, and your jaws are too weak for anything tougher than suet. Yet you finished the goose with the bones and the beak. Pray, how did you manage to do it? In my youth, said his father, I took to the law and argued each case with my wife. And the muscular strength which it gave to my jaw has lasted the rest of my life. You are old, said the youth, one would hardly suppose that your eye was as steady as ever. Yet you balanced an eel on the end of your nose. What made you so awfully clever? I have answered 3 questions, and that is enough, said his father. Don't give yourself airs. Do you think I can listen all day to such stuff? Be off, or I'll kick you downstairs. So that was a silly poem, and I like the part when he talks about balancing an eel on the end of his nose. What else do you think is silly? That is not said right, said the caterpillar. Not quite right, I'm afraid, said Alice timidly. Some of the words have got altered. It is wrong from beginning to end, said the caterpillar decidedly, and there was silence for some minutes. The caterpillar was the first to speak. What size do you want to be, it asked. Oh, I'm not a particular as to size, Alice hastily replied. Only one doesn't like changing so often, you know. I don't know, said the caterpillar. Alice said nothing. She had never been so much contradicted in her whole life before, and she felt she was losing her temper. I think probably here Alice is trying to use that self-control. Are you content now, said the caterpillar. Well, I should like to be a little larger, sir, if you wouldn't mind, said Alice. 3 inches is such a wretched height to be. It is a very good height indeed, said the caterpillar, angrily rearing itself upright as it spoke. It was exactly 3 inches high. What size do you think you would want to be? But I'm not used to it, pleaded poor Alice in a pitiful tone. And she thought to herself, I wish the creatures wouldn't be so easily offended. You'll get used to it in time, said the caterpillar, and he put the hookah into his mouth and began smoking again. This time, Alice waited patiently until it chose to speak again. Remember our virtue of patience, that is waiting without complaining? In a minute or two, the caterpillar took the hookah out of its mouth and yawned once or twice and shook itself. Then it got down off the mushroom and crawled away in the grass, merely remarking as it went, one side will make you grow taller, and the other side will make you grow shorter. One side of what? The other side of what? Thought Alice to herself. Of the mushroom, said the caterpillar, just as if he had asked it out loud. And in another moment, it was out of sight. Alice remained looking thoughtfully at the mushroom for a moment, trying to make out which were the 2 sides of it, as it was perfectly round. She was very confused. She's been confused several times. Are you ever confused? However, at last, she stretched her arms round as far as they would go and broke off a bit of the edge with each hand. And now, which is which, she said to herself, and nibbled a little of the right-hand bit to try the effect. The next moment, she felt a violent blow underneath her chin. It had struck her foot. She was a good deal frightened by this very sudden change. But she felt there was no time to be lost, as she was shrinking rapidly. So she set to work at once to eat some of the other bit. Her chin was pressed so closely against her foot there was hardly room to open her mouth. But at last she did it, and she managed to swallow a morsel, or a tiny little bit, of the left-handed bit. Come, my head's free at last, said Alice in a tone of delight, which changed into alarm in another moment. She found that her shoulders were nowhere to be found. All she could see was when she looked down was an immense length of neck, which seemed to rise like a stalk out of the sea of green leaves that lay far below her. "What can all that green stuff be?" said Alice. "And where have my shoulders gone to? And oh, my poor hands! How is it that I can't see you?" She was moving them about as she spoke, but no result seemed to follow except a little shaking among the distant leaves. And there seemed no chance of getting her hands up to her head. She tried to get her head down to them, and she was delighted to find that her neck would bend as easy as any direction, just like a serpent. She had just succeeded in curving it down into a graceful zigzag and was going to dive in among the leaves, which she found to be nothing but the tops of trees, which she had been wondering when the sharp hiss made her draw back in a hurry. A large pigeon had flown into her face and was beating her violently with his wings. "Serpent!" screamed the pigeon. "I am not a serpent," said Alice indignantly. "Let me alone." "Serpent, I say again," repeated the pigeon, but in a more subdued tone, and added with a kind of sob, "I've tried every way and nothing seems to suit them." "I haven't the least idea what you're talking about," said Alice. "I've tried the roots of trees, I've tried banks, I've tried hedges." The pigeon went on without attending to her. "But those serpents, there's no pleasing them." Alice was more puzzled than she thought. There was no use in saying anything more till the pigeon had finished. "As if it wasn't trouble enough hatching the eggs," said the pigeon. "But I must be on the lookout for serpents night and day. Why, I haven't had a wink of sleep in these 3 weeks." "I'm very sorry you've been annoyed," said Alice, who was beginning to see its meaning. She was trying to be kind, wasn't she? Showing care for others even when they weren't caring for her. "And just as I had taken the highest tree in the wood," continued the pigeon, raising its voice to a shriek, "and just as I was thinking I should be free of them at last, the must needs come wriggling down from the sky. Ugh, a serpent." "But I'm not a serpent, I tell you," said Alice. I'm a... "Well, what are you?" said the pigeon. "I can see you're trying to invent something." "I'm a little girl," said Alice rather doubtfully as she remembered the number of changes she had gone through. "A likely story indeed," said the pigeon in a tone of contempt. "I've seen a good many little girls in my time, but never one with a neck such as that. No, no. You're a serpent and there's no use denying it. I suppose you'll be telling me next you've never tasted an egg." "I have tasted eggs, certainly," said Alice, who was a very truthful child. "But little girls eat eggs quite as much as serpents do, you know." "I don't believe it," said the pigeon. "But if they do, why are they the kind of serpent? That's all I can say." This was a new idea to Alice, and she was quite silent for a minute or two, which gave the pigeon the opportunity for adding, "You're looking for eggs, I know that well enough. And what does it matter to me whether you're a little girl or a serpent?" "It matters a good deal to me," said Alice. "But I'm not looking for eggs, as it happens. If I was, I shouldn't want yours. I don't like them raw." "We'll be off then," said the pigeon in a sulky tone. Alice crouched out among the trees as well as she could, for her neck kept getting entangled among the branches, and every now and then she had to stop and untwist it. After a while she remembered that she still held the pieces of mushrooms in her hands, and she set to work very carefully, nibbling first at one and then at the other, sometimes growing taller and sometimes shorter, until she had succeeded in bringing herself down to her usual height. It had been so long since she had been anything near the right size that it felt quite strange at first. But she got used to it in a few minutes and began talking to herself as usual. "Come, there's half my plan done now. How puzzling all these changes are. I'm never sure what I'm going to be from one minute to another. However, I've got back to my right size. The next thing is to get into this beautiful garden. How is that to be done, I wonder?" As she said this, she came suddenly upon an open place where a little house in it was about 4 feet high. "Whoever lives there," thought Alice, "it'll never do to come upon them this size. Why, I should frighten them out of their wits." So she began nibbling at the right-hand bed again, and did not venture to go near the house till she had brought herself down to 9 inches high. So Alice is making a lot of changes still, and she's trying to figure out who she is. She escaped and didn't look like a serpent to the pigeon, and she got to her right size, but then she came up to a little house, and she was being thoughtful. She didn't want to scare the people or the animals in the little house, so she shrunk herself again. So we've seen a lot of silly things happen in this chapter, so maybe you could act out the silly things you heard in the poem or draw them, Or maybe you could try to write a silly poem yourself.